My presentation is called 5 Fitness Facts That Could Save Your Life. And so 10 years ago, I gave a very similar presentation right here. I like to think I'm smarter, I'm definitely bigger, hopefully a little wiser than I was 10 years ago when I gave this presentation. It was called Movement is Medicine, Prescribing the World's Strongest Medicine. Obviously, that's the name of my business. It's something I'm very passionate about. How to build fitness programs to improve both health span and lifespan. How can we have an impact on our clients' obviously length of life, but their day-to-day well-being? And the benefit is, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a big explosion of popular science, resources that are at not only our disposal, but our clients' disposal. Great people like Peter Attia, Rhonda Patrick, who are doing a great job delivering the science through things like podcasts, things like YouTube, and books. You've really seen an explosion recently. And real credit to them, I learn a lot from them. But even still, I think the things that they deliver are probably out of reach from the average client. I know when I listen to either of their podcasts, I probably have to rewind it 3 to 5 times and take notes to get clarity on some of the science. And so I think sometimes even though we have this information and we have these resources, they're still out of reach sometimes from our clients' everyday practice and their understanding on what they can do for their health. And to make matters worse, there's also no shortage of shitty fitness influencers out there that make it even harder for our clients to understand what they should do. In 2024, there's no shortage of information. What we have is filter failure, meaning you have people telling you should only eat liver, people telling you should put butter in your coffee, or you shouldn't eat seed oils and you're going to die. And those are the things your clients see and read and think, oh my God, what should I do? And we have to try to dispel some of the bullshit, so to speak. And so really, it falls to all of you to be the front line of healthcare for your coaches. For your clients, rather. They're the first person, when they have a problem, they don't go to the doctor. They come to see you. Statistically, the average American sees their doctor 4 times per year, if you're over the age of 18. Now, that number is really skewed, right? Because there's a whole swath of the population that never goes to the doctor. And there's a bunch of frequent flyers who are going every single week. But if you show up, if you train 2 days a week, you show up 80% of the time, that's 100 visits to your personal trainer. And so who stands to have a bigger impact on your client's health long term? It's you. And they're going to come and ask you questions. They're going to say, hey, I read this on a podcast. I saw this on Instagram. I saw this on YouTube. It's our job to actually provide on-the-ground practical interventions for their health. And so we need to be able to decipher the information and find how can I deliver the best fitness program possible to ensure your health long term. How many of you work with Gen Pop clients, like everyday people? Right? The majority of you. I would say most people look at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning and think of athletes. The majority of our revenue, the majority of our clients are everyday people like you see in there working out right now. And so what we really need to focus on is how to improve their health. And so these are the people we're trying to help. And as it stands right now, we're kind of failing. If you look at the statistics, less than 50% of people meet the minimum aerobic and strength training guidelines laid out by the U.S. Health Association. Less than 7% meet the strength training guidelines alone. And so we're falling well below the minimum effective dose as it's defined by the U.S. Health Association. And stunning rise in obesity, you can see 1980, there's a huge inflection point of weight gain. And then when you look at the spending in America on healthcare, 90% of spending in healthcare is on chronic health conditions, things like hypertension, diabetes, anxiety, atherosclerosis, all chronic healthcare disorders. They're generally directly related to lifestyle, how much we move and what we eat. And so right now it's kind of out of control. And so for us, we're the people working with people every day, and we need to have the interventions for that. And there's no shortage of exercise. America is by far the leader in healthcare memberships in the entire world, right? 2019, there were 64.2 million health club memberships in America, okay, growing every year. The fitness sector is $1 billion industry, right? We have no shortage, $37 billion on fitness memberships, $57.6 billion on sports active recreation spending. So we're spending money. We're just not getting the outcomes that we want. And so it comes down to the interventions and us getting more people moving. And so what I really want to talk about today is how do we start with people and how do we help people actually need it? Obviously, we know exercise is good. Right? That shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Anybody who comes to the gym knows that. But how do we get the average person started in a way that's effective? And how do we build them from there? how should we build programs to ensure both health span and lifespan? Because it's two different things, right? Statistically, people are living longer than they ever have. That doesn't mean we're living healthier, right? And so what we're trying to do is compress the morbidity between those two curves. This is something, I think I got that graphic from Pat Van Galen originally, right? Most people, what's the quote? I think most people die at 30 and their body sticks around for another 40 years, right? And so what we want to do is we're trying to be a lot more like that green curve, not like the red curve. That's the reality of most people, is that downward slide probably starts around 30. Aging isn't an old person problem. It's a young person problem where the symptoms show up once you start to get to 40, 50, 60, 70, and so on. Generally, you want to die hard and fast, right? Most people aren't afraid of actually dying. They're afraid of that downslide of loss of independence, loss of immobility, progressively failing health as they get to middle life. And so the things I really want to touch on, what are the big levers that I think we can pull to improve quality of life? Muscle mass, muscle function, specifically strength and power, bone density, cardiovascular function, cognitive health, and then daily low-intensity physical activity. These are the things that I think we can have the biggest impact with our clients, where we can start to provide interventions both in the gym and outside of the time that they're with us. And so what I want to start with is the idea of progressive physical frailty, sarcopenia, and loss of independence. I think that this is where it begins. Again, I don't think aging's an old person problem. I think people stop training themselves, stop being active at 30, and then they lose their independence all of a sudden 20 years later, and they don't realize what happened. So fact number one, low muscle mass and function makes you 12 times more likely to lose independence with age. Meaning, how much muscle are you carrying and how well can you use it? So sarcopenia is a problem, and I think that's where the downward slide begins. As you see progressive losses in strength and power, you see people start to exercise and have physical activity less, and then the metabolic decline starts from there. Sarcopenia is a significant predictor of all-cause mortality among community older dwelling adults. And muscle strength, if you're not training, roughly declines at about 3% per year in adults after 30. So if you're not exercising, you're consistently getting weaker. You're twice as likely to have osteoporosis if you have sarcopenia, and it's independently associated with cognitive impairment with things like dementia and Alzheimer's. And the problem is, individuals that are 60 plus is the largest growing segment of our population. Again, we're keeping people alive longer, but they're just not healthier. And so for you guys, as who are you going to be working with, that's probably the segment of the population that has money to pay you, and there's the most of them. And so we have to think about how are we going to continue to train them, even if it's a late life intervention. Because this is that downward slide that tends to happen, right? When you start to lose your robustness, different stressors start to build frailty, right? An accidental fall, a hip injury, a back injury, a sickness, right? And all of a sudden, that downward slide accelerates for people over time. And I think it really starts with muscle mass because it improves our ability to deal with stressors. And it's not just physical, but it's metabolic, right? As people become inactive, typically because they're weak, or they're weak because they're inactive, you tend to see more visceral fat accumulation, more chronic systemic inflammation, and then all these inflammation-related diseases. Statistically, this is what we call like the 4 horsemen of the geriatric apocalypse, right? Insulin resistance, so diabetes, atherosclerosis, heart disease, neurodegeneration like cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, and then tumor growth and cancer. And so generally, if we can keep moving, we stem all of these things from showing up. So looking at that study that I referenced for that first fact, they looked at a bunch of aging adults, and they tracked muscle mass, muscle function as they age. They found having low muscle mass makes you about 1.5 times more likely to lose your independence. Having low muscle function as defined by like a sit-to-stand test, which we'll talk about in a minute, makes you 5.7 times more likely to lose your independence. Can you get up out of the chair? Can you walk to the mailbox? Can you take out the garbage at the end of the day? And then having both makes you over 12 times more likely to lose your function as you get older. So you can't overstate the value of muscle as we get older. I want to be able to do the things that my parents are doing, right? Like that's my daughter, that's my nephew, walking with my parents. My dad, he's 66, carrying my daughter around without a problem. Like there's a lot of people in their 60s that might struggle with that. This is Stu and Nancy. They're a 3-generation family that trains here. So they're in their 80s. That's their daughter. That's their granddaughter. Like that's what you want to be able to do when you get to that age. But they didn't start training in their 70s. They've been active their entire life, right? You can't have that probably if you start at 70, maybe. But the intervention has to start sooner. They've been active for their entire life, so they're able to have this valuable extension of their active time as they get older, right? So sit to stand test, 30-second sit to stand test is one of the most widely researched muscle function tests there is. So there's a lot of data behind it. Really simple. Take an 18-inch box, 18-inch chair, like one of those plyo boxes, hands on the shoulders, sit up and down as many times as you can in 30 seconds. It's useful because there's a lot of research behind it. So when you look at the standards for different age ranges, 60 up to 94, these are the minimums you want to see for them to not lose their independence as they get older. So Stu and Nancy are both in their mid-80s, right? For men, less than 10. For women, less than 9, right? And so they travel half the year. I told you they're very active. They go to Italy for 6 months, and they come back here from 6 months. Not a bad life. But when they come back, we'll do some assessments to kind of see, where are they at. And I'll say, all right, let's do the sit-to-stand test, okay? Real simple. So if you have people coming in and you're not sure, hey, I'm not ready to start lifting them, let's see where they're at. Just have them go, 30 seconds, set a clock, up and down. Again, there's a lot of research behind it. So for you can start to stratify risk for people and start to give them feedback upon their improvement. Simple intervention. She got 14, he got 12, I believe. And he's a big guy. He's probably 6'4", 250-something pounds. So they crushed that. Easy intervention, easy proxy measure for you to start to measure muscle power, as they call it, or muscle function for the lower body. Additionally, using a grip dynamometer, really easy proxy measure. It's not the people with really strong hands live longer, but generally grip strength is a signifier of their overall robustness and health. And there's no injury risk. So those are the minimum cutoffs based on the US studies. 26 kilos for men, 16 kilos for women, 90-degree elbow, squeeze as hard as you can. You want to see them at least at those numbers or higher. Again, easy intervention for you to continue to track people's progress. Obviously, you're going to be tracking their lifting in the gym, but a grip dynamometer is about $25 on Amazon for you to kind of measure their progress. One last proxy measure is push-ups, right? Most people probably have their clients doing push-ups. This was a fascinating study, a firefighter study. They had thousands of firefighters they tracked over their life to look at risk of cardiovascular disease. What they found was push-up capacity was inversely associated with 10-year risk of cardiovascular events in men aged 21 to 66. Participants able to perform 11 or more push-ups at baseline had significantly reduced risk of cardiovascular events. Only 11. Not that much. How many of you can do 11 push-ups? Oh, all right. I thought there'd be more. Okay. Men able to do 40 push-ups had 96% reduced risk of cardiovascular events compared to those who were able to do less than 10. Again, easy proxy measures for you to track people's progress. People want feedback, and for you, it's going to allow you to stratify risk. Okay. Strength training should be simple. How many of you have taken a CFSC course? Right, so this should all look pretty familiar to you, right? I think we overcomplicate strength programming way too much. The average person needs 2 to 3 times a week full body programs. If you look at the statistics, the average person who goes to the gym goes 1.5 times per week. So that's going to mean you have to do full body programming. You can't do back and bis, upper, lower, splits. The only way you're going to get the stimulus in is if you give them full body programs, especially if they're only coming 2 or 3 days a week. It allows for more efficiency and maximal stimulus during the week. If you look at our adult program that we put together, we just have 12 months where we vary the intensity, vary the volume, vary the tempo, or vary the exercise variation. Every day it's probably push, pull, hip, knee, trunk in some capacity. So I'll show you the program at the very end today. But I think if you're doing that consistently and slowly using progressive resistance and varying the stimulus, you're going to get people a long way. I mean, Stu and Nancy I've had for about 10 years, and we're continually just rotating through the program over time to get them the stimulus that they need. Here's some good examples of our clients training. This is Ann. Where's Jess? Oh, she's not here. This is Jess's client, Ann. Oh, how old's Ann? 82. Yeah, Nico too. Yeah. But she's been coming here longer than I've worked here. So again, this is a long, we have to think about a long-term approach with training our clients. She's 82 years old. She's absolutely crushing those push-ups, right? This isn't something that happens overnight. I'm going to keep going until she stops because I want to see all of them. Yeah, ran out of gas there. That was really good, right? Or someone like Jim. Jim is 79. I've been training him the whole time I've worked here. Right? Again, it's a long-term investment. He's been here longer than I've worked here, but he comes 3 or 4 days a week consistently all the time. Slow little improvements add up. And now at 79, right, he might not be lifting the same weights he was when he was 60, but He's a hell of a lot stronger than any other 79-year-old I know. And so it's about long-term investments. There you go, some little squat to press. I tried to get all the different movement patterns in, right? Pause RFEs, not bad, right? And so we try to think, are we doing single leg? Are we doing bilateral? Are we doing hip dominant? Are we doing knee dominant? Are we pushing and are we pulling? Okay? And then most importantly, probably for our older population, is our single leg work, right? The majority of life is done on one leg. We're going to talk about accidental falls in a minute. One of the highest risks for death once you get north of 60. He calls these as one-leg toilet squats. So he says, I can get up and down off the toilet on one leg. And so continuing to keep variable movement patterns like this in the program is very, very important. Okay? And here's Stu. I mean, Stu's a bigger guy, so we just start assisted split squats. But this is fine. This is clearly during COVID, right? And so for him, I don't necessarily need to add weight, but we're going to do body weight split squats every day and probably load goblet squats, okay? And I'm perfectly fine with it. There's Lisa, she's in her 60s, right? And so, again, consistent inputs over time make a really, really big difference. And so what does a basic program look like, okay? Again, it doesn't have to be that complicated. KISS, keep it simple, stupid, right? If you look at each day, there's a knee dominant, goblet squat, anterior core front plank, leg lower, so like active hip mobility, reaching single leg deadlift, dumbbell bench press, half kneeling lift, dumbbell row. That might be like an intro program for someone who's new, right? And then again, we'll vary the load, vary the intensity, vary the tempo. But I don't think it has to. That's generally what all of our adult programs look like. Pairings and trisets done over the course of 60 minutes. So kind of going from there, talking about accidental falls and osteoporosis. Your mortality risk increases 178% in the year following a hip fracture after 60 years of age. Statistically, the biggest risk for an accidental death after 60 is an accidental fall. So if you look here, these are the different age ranges, 25, 35, 45, 55. You see at 65, that yellow piece gets a lot bigger. If you're in your 20s, you're big at that red, that's overdoses. Once you get up to your 60s, you see that yellow grow, yellow grow, yellow grow. Statistically, the biggest cause for an accidental death after 60 is an accidental fall. And so we have to think about, one, how do we keep people from falling in the first place? And if they do hit the ground, how do we get them to be more resilient to be able to bounce back? One of our clients, just yesterday, I was in the shower, and he said, I had a really bad fall skiing last week. John's got to be 60, almost 70. And he said, I swear if I wasn't working out here, it could have been really, really bad. He just came up with a couple scrapes. He was skiing full speed down the mountain. Someone cut him off, and he fell. And he was in here working out 2 days later. But he said he's been coming here 2-3 days a week for a long period of time. So to look at that statistic in another way, the hazard ratio of a hip fracture after 60 is 2.78, meaning you're 2.78 times more likely to die in the year following a hip fracture than if you didn't. And to compare that to some other things that we know are bad, the hazard ratio for smoking and death is about a 2. And we all know, I don't think anybody here smokes. The hazard ratio of end-stage renal disease, which kills most people, is 2.76. So it's a serious issue to think about. And what you bring with bone density for you at 30 is really what you take with you for the rest of your life. We don't really add bone after 30. So again, aging is a young person's problem. The inputs you start when you're in your teens, in your 20s, that's the bone density that you bring with you for the rest of your life. And so at the age of 30, you can expect a decline of about 0.2 to 0.5% per year. Women have much more unfortunate reality because of menopause. They start to accelerate about 50% faster than men at that point. And so it's really important. We have a lot of kids that are training, and I always think like almost none of these kids are going to be professional athletes. But they're building bone and they're building muscle strength that they're going to bring with them into their 30s, 40s, 50s, and from there. Okay? And so our goal is to try to get people to their full genetic potential in their 30s, because then they have to hold on for dear life by getting adequate protein, caloric intake, and exercise from there on out. And so again, it's hard for young people to have this delayed gratification when they think that they're training for 60, 70, but trying to tell them when they first start working out, like this is what you're putting investments in the bank. It's like compounding interest in an investment account that pays off. And everyone knows if you start investing at 18 versus when you start investing at like 25, your outcome's a lot different, right? Because in compound interest, your money doubles about every 7 years. And so it's the same thing with exercise. And think of it like finance. It goes really well. And so when it comes to bone density, think about targeting the areas that we lose the most. And if we build a well-structured program, like we talked about previously, we should do that. The areas where they test for bone density are usually hip and pelvis, vertebrae, and humerus. those are also the areas where they're most frequently going to get fractures. They're the places that are easiest to test. And so whether it's deadlifting or single leg deadlifting, single leg loading allows for higher hip and pelvis loads. So if you're looking to build pelvic density or hip bone density, really helpful. Vertebrae, carries, deadlifts, and swings, and then humerus, obviously pushing and pulling. So I just tried to highlight some of the ladies crushing it here. They're all in their 30s or older. Kathy, crushing some walking lunges. But again, if you're building a really well-structured program, you should be able to build density in these areas as long as we're continuing to add load progressively over time, right? Those are some loaded chins for Jonesy. Pretty good, okay? Bonus fact right here. Lower body power is the best predictor that we have for accidental fall risk. There's a ton of research on, hey, how can we predict an accidental fall for people as they get older? And unanimously, when you look at all the research, measurements of lower body power, they typically do like rapid leg extensions or rapid leg press. I'd argue we probably have better tests and interventions that we could use. But unanimously, our ability to produce power as we get older is the best predictor that we have. And so when they look at a 3-year change in older community-dwelling adults in their 60s, and these are untrained people, sedentary people, over 3 years, they lost muscle mass by about 3.8%. They lost strength by 5.9%, but they lost power over 11%. So our nervous system degrades much quicker than our actual muscle mass does. Because as we get older, our nerve connections get weaker, our myelination starts to break down. So if we're not continually stimulating it by moving quickly and training our nervous system to produce power, it goes down pretty quick. And so it's something that I think many people are afraid to do with our older clients because they're worried about injury, rightfully so. But I couldn't stress enough how important it is to do things like plyometrics, skipping, med ball throwing, things like that as people get older so they can still have that snap and they can still have that bounce in their step, okay? And so for us, like I said, muscle power is more important than strength to prevent accidental falls. It's much more predictive of functional dependency with age than strength or cardiovascular is. And so we're thinking about two things: improving push-off, lower limb extensor power, but also landing skills, our ability to decelerate rapid eccentric strength upon landing. Because what tends to happen, how do old people tend to walk? They shuffle. They start to shuffle because they can't push off, which puts you at risk for tripping. And then when they go to fall, if they can't react and brake, that's typically when they hit the ground, right? And so what we want to do, whether it's in a warm-up, whether it's with sleds, whether it's with throwing med balls, here's Jim again, things like power skips, there's some rapid hip extension and lower limb extension. Things like sled sprints, moving as fast as he can, okay? It doesn't have to be power like you think about with your athletes. It doesn't have to be a big hurdle. It doesn't have to be high-speed plyometrics. But we think power is relative, right? Meaning to get a power improvement for them, we just need to do something that gets them moving faster than they do on a daily basis. And so everyone's going to start in a different point on that scale, right? Here's Ann again whipping a med ball, and another Ann doing some lateral bounds, and then Lisa jumping some hurdles, okay? And so what we tend to do is we put together what we call like a power circuits. They're going to throw some med balls, then they're going to walk over, jump a hurdle, or do some skips, and then they're going to maybe do a core exercise or mobility drill, and they're going to work through that tri-set 2 to 3 times, okay? So that's before we hit the lift, after we do our active warm-up. It takes maybe 10 minutes at the most. But whether someone like Ann, who at that time couldn't do any impact, we have something like the shuttle where she can jump and it slows her down when she hits the ground, right? So there's always a way, whether it's skipping, whether it's something as simple as ladder drills. There we got Bree up here. What we tend to do is we build it like this. Post warm-up, pre-lift, they'll jump, hop, or bound, do some sort of medicine ball throw, do some sort of mobility work, okay? Run through that circuit 2 to 3 times. If you don't currently throw medicine balls, I would say it's probably one of the best upper body tools you can use. If you invest in building something like a med ball wall, it's well worth it because it's a low risk, high reward activity. And again, we want to balance risk and reward. The thing about power work is you have your highest risk for an injury, probably from an impact standpoint, but I think we have the highest benefit. So be very conservative, whether that means they're just jumping over a line on the ground or they're just skipping down and back or doing ladder drills. Start there until you start to get more confident and they start to be more confident to do something a little bit more intensive, okay? I'm going to talk a lot about conditioning today. So VO2 max is directly correlated with all-cause mortality. So the higher your oxygen consumption, the more aerobically fit you are, the less likely you are to die, and that graph keeps going and there's no end, right? There's no top end where you stop benefiting from being more fit. How many people here enjoy doing conditioning? You have to learn to love it. I mean, I can speak. I used to try to skip it at all costs. Now I've really doubled down on my efforts. I'm a little bit inspired by Mike. If you follow him, he rides the bike like an animal every single week. But every 33 seconds, someone in the US dies from heart disease. And statistically, 50% of people's first symptoms of a cardiac event is a sudden death, right? And so we know cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer around the world. And our strongest, most potent thing we can do is conditioning work for it. No one likes to do it. Our clients don't like to do it, but we have to force them to do it. And the challenge always is how do we fit everything in the hour, right? If we care about all that strength training, we care about power, we care about mobility, in 60 minutes, how do we get all of that done? And that's kind of what I want to try to answer for you. But this was really interesting. So association of cardiorespiratory fitness with long-term mortality among adults undergoing exercise treadmill testing. Again, direct line. The more fit they were, the higher survival probability they had, and they didn't find a top end, right? And so again, if we really care about living longer, if you say you care about living longer and you're not doing conditioning, I'm not sure you're acting on what you want. I think that the strength training piece probably allows us access to more things, right? That's why I think we have to start with strength training. Because if you're frail, you're not going to have trouble doing just about anything. But if you really care about length of life, I think conditioning work is a non-negotiable, right? And so this is interesting. So if someone's sedentary, the average person's VO2 declines 4 to 5 milliliters per kilogram per minute per decade, right? So the way you measure VO2 is milliliters per kilogram per minute. So per decade, if you're inactive, it goes down about 4 to 5 kilograms. For every increase in 3.5, so 1 met of kilograms per minute, you decrease your heart disease risk by 15%. So it's almost the same number, right? Every decade, if you're not training, your heart disease risk goes up 15%, all other things equal. So for us, 3.5 is not a lot. If you're conditioning hard, you can make significant changes in your VO2 if you're conditioning hard 2 or 3 days a week. But most people just probably don't want to do it because it's uncomfortable. For us, most of the conditioning I'm going to talk about here is going to be done on the Aerobic. How many of you actually ride the Aerobic? Yeah, against your will, probably. But the reason we like it is there's zero orthopedic impact. Most people have trouble running. They have trouble doing Metcon circuits with weights. They'd have trouble doing the slide board. Just about anybody can hop on an Aerobic. And so it allows us a really easy way to get people started. There's zero technical learning curve. You got to teach people to run sometimes. You don't really have to teach people how to ride the bike outside of setting up their seat correctly, okay? And it's very easy management of pace of intensity because you can measure the time, the RPMs, the intensity right on the screen of the bike. And so I'm going to talk primarily about using the bike. That's definitely our favorite intervention tool. How many have heard of Zone 2 training? Really popular right now, right? Oh, I want to get that GIF going again. How do I do that? There we go. Okay. So what Zone 2 is what we call cardiac output work. Continuous work done at about 60 to 70% of your max heart rate for probably, they always say like minimum 30 minutes up to 90 minutes to get the intended effect. What does that do? As Charlie Weingroff coined it, eccentric heart. When you have a low heart rate, it allows your ventricle to fill up with as much blood as possible and then squirt a bunch out. It's like the Netflix workout. You could ride the bike at 60% heart rate, just watch Netflix for 30 minutes to an hour. I like doing that stuff. How many people actually enjoy doing Zone 2 work? Not a lot of hands, right? Because it takes a long time and it tends to be boring, right? And it's very popular right now, but we know it has a limited impact on our top-end VO2 max, meaning working in a really low intensity isn't necessarily going to do a great job pushing up the top end of your intensity. I think it's really valuable with people who have really low resting heart rates, as I would define above 60 beats per minute, but it's really time-consuming. So if you look at most of the recommendations from experts on how much Zone 2 work to do a week, they'll say 150 to 300 minutes per week. We already said less than 25% of people hit the 75 to 150 minutes a week of exercise recommended by the U.S. Healthcare Association. So we're not even coming close to that. And so I think if we're continually recommending people do Zone 2, Zone 2, Zone 2, they're not even doing half of that, much less the strength training and the power and all the other things that we ask them to do. So I think we need to sometimes look for a different intervention. Most people don't have 3 to 4 hours a week to dedicate to low intensity work. That doesn't mean it's not valuable, but if we're going to be practical and talk about the people that we're actually working with, I think we have to find a different approach. Eventually, maybe we can get them to start to dedicate some time outside their normal training sessions to do some lower intensity work, and that's something I'll talk about in a little bit. So I think the key parameter for improving your VO2 max is to actually train near it, so higher intensity intervals. Again, intensity intervals are uncomfortable, but they're probably the most effective way to improve our top-end oxygen consumption. So Dan Baker's an Australian researcher and strength conditioning coach, and he has this great paper, which I can include in the resources when you guys get these notes, called High-Intensity Aerobic Training for Field Sports. And they were finding what intervals to do, what intensities to do were most effective and time efficient to improve our aerobic power, so like our VO2 max. And this quote's really good. I'll read the whole thing because I always go back to it. He said, it didn't matter much if it was 20 seconds of work, 10 seconds of recovery, 30 seconds on, 15 off, 15 on, 15 off. The research kept pointing to the fact that training at or 100% of your max aerobic speed was the key intensity parameter for how long you spent there and the driving volume parameter for improving improvements of aerobic power. Meaning you just have to be at an adequate intensity, and over time, we can build volume. Interval of work allows us to accumulate more quality reps near our peak VO2, so we can drive our VO2 max up. And perceived lack of time is the largest cited reason why people don't exercise. And so if we can do high-intensity interval work that takes short periods of time, we get the most benefit with the least amount of investment of time, which for our clients is the most important thing. And so something that, again, that's been really popular recently is this idea of the Norwegian VO2 max protocol. Has anybody heard of this? Yeah, it's pretty brutal. I've been doing it. I told you missed out on it yesterday. And what they did, there was this study where they found having people do 4 minutes, 4 times, 3 minutes rest in between as fast as they could was the most effective way they found to improve people's VO2 max. Meaning hard as you can for 4 minutes, rest for 3 minutes, repeat 4 times. Again, I see your face, right? It's miserable. I did it yesterday. The problem is that's too hard for most of our clients to start with. Again, I was listening to the Atia podcast, and they were talking about how great it was. I said, I don't know a single person in my adult group that would be willing to endure that torture. Again, it's not even that long amount of work, but it's hard. And so what we need to do is progressively build time near there. We can't start even with those intervals. And so something I've done with my clients is just build volume progressively. 3 times 1 minute with 2 minutes rest. 3 minutes total of work. 4 by 1 minute, 2 minute rest, 4 minutes total. 3 by a minute, 30. 4 by a minute, 30. 3 by 2, 4 by 2. So we have to scale back the intervention and start to progressively build volume over time. I think most of the recommendations you hear are just way too far out of reach for the average person. But it is very effective. Most research says you want to build about 3 to 8 minutes of total time near your VO2 to start to see improvements. This is really interesting. They took 12 weeks of interval training and compared it to 12 weeks of zone 2 work, right? So one group did 3 by 20 seconds as hard as they could with 2 minutes rest in between each interval. One group did 3 by 45 minutes of 70% heart rate, right? So a total of 3 45-minute sessions versus 3 60-second sessions. They had similar improvements in VO2, insulin sensitivity, and mitochondrial content. 30 minutes versus 150 minutes per week. Again, it's not to say the zone 2 stuff isn't effective, it's just time consuming. And so if we can get those similar results doing 3 by 20 seconds at the end of a workout, just as long as they're working at a hard enough intensity, I'd say we start there. And then once they start to buy into the process, maybe then we can start to include things that are a little bit more intensive or long duration in nature. This was also interesting, just another protocol to think about. High intensity decreasing interval increases time above VO2, meaning progressively shorter intervals over the course of the intervention, right? So one group did 30 seconds on, 20 seconds off, 12 times. One group did 3 minutes on, 2 minutes on, 1 minute on, 40 seconds on, 30 seconds on, 30 seconds on. So decreasing rest, decreasing work rate. And then one group did long intervals, kind of like those VO2, 4 by 4 minutes. And doing those decreasing intervals where you go from 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 1 minute, 40 seconds, increase their time above 90% of their VO2, which is what we're trying to look at to improve their oxygen consumption. And so something Mike, I always say, kind of gets to these things intuitively. We do a lot here is like, hey, you're going to do 1 mile, then a 0.9, then a 0.8, then a 0.7, and you could start lower than that. If you look at our adult program, I think right now we have a half mile, a 0.4, a 0.3, a 0.2, a 0.1. But it allows them to keep their intensity up because the work periods get shorter, and they're able to keep their intensity up over the entire period of time. So what I would ask, people always say they need to build an aerobic base. How many of you have heard that saying, oh, you got to build an aerobic base? The problem is the aerobic base takes time. And most people orthopedically can't do that amount of work when they first start training with you. Like they start to break down, especially if it's something like running. And so what we always say is build the pyramid upside down. I stole this directly from one of Mike's presentations, so he gets credit for this. But we just put 30 seconds up as an example, but it could be any length of time. Start with go 2 intervals, 3 intervals, 4 intervals, 5 intervals, build it that way. Because anyone can do 2 hard 30-second sprints at their relative intensity. It's really hard to go the other way, right? And over time, we can progress the intensity and progressively add volume as people get better. And so what do we actually do here with our adults and our athletes is, there's me doing a bike test. Do a 2-mile time trial or a max aerobic speed test on the bike. So what we say is, hey, you're gonna hop on the air bike. I want you to go for 2 miles as fast as you can. And when I say as fast as you can, I don't mean come out like this and then crash. I'll say a sustained intensity. How many of you currently ride the bike, did I say? Okay, so if you're not currently, start, because you can't progress. I wasn't actually pedaling that fast. If you're not currently riding, it's hard to give someone a recommendation. And so they'll say, hey, what RPM should I start at? And maybe I'll say, hey, start at 55 RPMs for the first minute. Let's see how you're feeling. If it feels hard, we'll try to stay there. If it feels easy, maybe we'll up it an RPM or 2. But you have to know, if you're not doing conditioning, you can't prescribe it, right? And so I'll say, ride as hard as you can for the 2 miles. And then by definition, their average RPM, which shows on the bike, over the course of that time trial, is their max aerobic speed, the hardest intensity they can maintain aerobically for that period of time. So then we'll take that number. Let's just say my average RPM was 70 RPMs. We have a nifty little chart, which you'll have access to, okay? And you have your intervals, 10, 20, 20, 10, different distances on the side. You go to your interval, go down, and it does the math for you. So what we tell people is we want you at 120% of your max aerobic speed while you're doing these intervals. The reason we do that is because what happens when you give clients intervals for the first time? The first 2, they come out as hard as they freaking can, right? And then the last 6, they're going like half speed. So those last 6 are worthless. If we go back to that Dan Baker quote, the key intensity parameters, they had to be at or above their max aerobic speed during the intervals to get improvements. So we want to prescribe them, just like we put weights on a bar, this is the intensity that you should be at. And so this sets the basement. So 120% or 110% is a great place to start. And we'll say, hey, you're going to go 10 seconds on, 20 seconds off at 120, 8 times. That takes 4 minutes. So we can do our whole strength training program, we can do our power, mobility, and we can still fit that in at the end so you get conditioning intervention. Okay? And over time, we just build the volume. So week 1, 10, 20, 8 times. Week 2, 10, 20, 8 times for 2 rounds. The next week, we'll go 15, 15 in 2020, and then 15, 15 for twice, then 20, 10, and 15, 15, and then 2 20-10s. So now you got 6 weeks of conditioning worked out, and hopefully by then, they're starting to buy into it a little bit. They're starting to get a little bit better, and then we can start to maybe introduce different intervals, right? But this is really our go-to for both our athletes and our adults when we do bike interventions, okay? That makes sense to everybody? No questions? That was clear? Okay. Right, and so for us, in summary for conditioning, I would say start short and sweet, right? 10, 20s, and 20, 10s, do a bike test so you can figure out the appropriate intensity for them and get them on there and get them started. Build volume as you go. Once they start to get better and they get a little bit more fit, you can do more extensive intervals. So things like half miles, that should probably take, the average Gen Pop person like 90 seconds. Let them rest, go again, hey, we're gonna do 2 or 3 half miles today and build up the volume. Then you can start to work towards longer bouts near your VO2 max, things that are like 1 to 3 miles at a time. But you can't start with those things. I think you have to think about a long-term approach to getting them to start to buy into doing conditioning, okay? Going to the next fact, number 4. So exercise capacity is inversely and independently associated with onset of Alzheimer's, dementia, and cognitive impairment. If you look at the numbers, Alzheimer's disease and dementia is the fastest growing cause for death and disease in America currently. We've put a dent in cancers, we put a dent in heart disease, stroke, HIV. Alzheimer's grown 89%. A big reason for that is because we're keeping people alive longer, right? So we have this growing segment of the population over 60 who's inherently unhealthy, and what starts to decline while we keep them alive is their ability to think and strategize and have memory. And so It's something you guys are going to have to deal with clients as they get older and your business grows. And so lifelong exercise, we can see that we can maintain cognitive function or slow the decline of cognitive function as people get older. Even late-line interventions can have a huge impact on how people's brain works. If you start to see them slip, they start to exercise, you see improvements in executive function, you see improvements in memory. And so I don't think it's too late for anybody. How many times do you hear clients say, hey, when I work out during the day, I feel so much better at work, or I feel my energy's better, I feel smarter, I have better memory, even for kids. And so can't overstate how valuable that is. This is really interesting. For years, they just thought our brains automatically got smaller as we got older. They just accepted you would lose brain volume. But they took a group of 60-year-old men who were untrained, and they did fMRI so they could see the volume and size of their brain. And then they put them on a 12-week exercise program, probably not nearly as good as anything that you guys would prescribe. It was just like a low-intensity walking and aerobic program. And even with that, they found significant increases in brain volume, and both gray and white matter were found as a function of fitness training and those who participate in aerobic fitness. And so they actually grew their brain size in their 60s. And not only that, they saw improvements in things like executive function and memory, which is usually what starts to slide downwards as people get older. And so the systemized review of a bunch of different studies, they found 30 to 60 minutes of strength training aerobic done per week for 12 weeks improved executive function, brain volume, neural proliferation, increased neural activation when they did things like a functional MRI and looked at how their brain was working. Even something as little as walking 3 times per week improved memory test and increased hippocampus volume. Your hippocampus is usually the main thing that shrinks when you have things like Alzheimer's and dementia. So the interventions didn't even have to be as robust or as thorough as the things that you would probably prescribe. And so I always like to bring this up because a lot of us identify like physically, hey, we want to be able to play sports, or we want to be able to still lift or do things with our kids. But some people really just want to identify with what they can do cognitively as they get older. And so people are going to be motivated by different things. And I think just about everyone is scared of cognitive decline as they get older. And so if being physically fit doesn't necessarily motivate people, I think being cognitively fit definitely motivates people as they get older. And so we talked about METs when we talked about VO2. For each metabolic equivalent increase in exercise capacity conferred about an 8% reduction of cognitive impairment as people get older. So that 3.5 milliliters per kilogram. Executive functions of thought associated with frontal lobe and hippocampus regions of the brain are sustained and enhanced with people with higher levels of fitness. So unanimously, as people's VO2 and fitness level goes up, they tend to see better improvements in things like memory tests, executive function tests. And again, you probably know that empirically with your clients. If you think about some of your older clients who are active all the time, you're like, wow, they're really with it. They're really sharp. And that's, it's not a mistake, right? It's really interesting. I mean, we've always been afraid of things like lactate or lactic acid, right? But it's interesting, there's research around these things, what we call exerkines. Molecules, signaling molecules that our muscles, our blood cells, our organs produce while we exercise, that actually have a huge impact on our neural health and our cognitive health. So our bodies produce signaling molecules that reduce oxidative stress, inflammation, improve neurogenesis, and improve mitochondrial health. Lactate specifically, when do you produce lactate? High-intensity interval training, right? Crosses the blood-brain barrier and helps neural proliferation in the brain to grow new brain cells. There's actually a lot of emerging research around brain impact-related injuries in using lactate to improve recovery from things like traumatic brain injuries and concussions. BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic growth factor, from the shear stress of blood flow from high-intensity interval training. The blood's pumping through your arteries really quick. You produce BDNF in your arteries, crosses the blood-brain barrier, helps you grow nerve cells in your brain. And so these are all things that don't happen unless you exercise, right? The lactate is produced with high-intensity exercise. BDNF is produced with high-intensity exercise. Another thing with the brain is I think the warm-up is criminally overlooked and undervalued by fitness professionals, right? What is the thing that most of us want to skip when we're short on time? Is the warm-up. What is the thing our clients kind of go through the motion during? Is the warm-up. If you go to most health clubs, if you went down to whatever health club down the street and walked in, what would most people be doing for their warm-up? They just walk on the treadmill, riding the bike on the elliptical for like 5 minutes, and they're like, couple of these, and they go and train, right? And if you go back to like, what are the goals of a warm-up? If you go to Mark Verstegen's core performance from like, I don't know, 2004, I remember him saying, increase body tissue temperature, ramp up the central nervous system, prepare for the patterns of the upcoming training session and competition. There's a lot of ways you can check those boxes, right? Increase your body tissue temperature. I could chase you around here for 5 minutes, and that'd get your body tissue temperature up, right? Going on the treadmill, bike would work for that. Ramp up your CNS. Things are going to get you moving quickly, right? And then rehearsing the patterns you're about to train. So maybe doing some hinging before you deadlift or doing some squatting before you squat. But I think if I was going to add one thing, I would say it's also neurological training. It's a really good opportunity to challenge our clients to move in various planes and challenge their nervous system to regain some function when that they had when they were younger, right? Really good book. If you're going to buy anything, there's a book by Carla Hannaford. She's brilliant. It's called Why Learning's Not in Your Head. And she talks about using exercise for kids to help learning. Some really good quote that she said in there. Muscular activities, particularly coordinated cross-body movements, appear to stimulate the production of neurotrophins, such as dopamine, that stimulate the growth of existing nerve cells and neural connections in the brain. So coordinated cross-body movements, things like ladder drills, things like skipping, things like shuffling, things like crawling. The warm-up is a really convenient time to include dynamic multiplanar movements that challenge the nervous system in the brain. Things that we wouldn't be, movement patterns and planes we wouldn't be willing to load in the weight room, but things we can do safely to challenge our clients. Things like ladder drills, active warm-up, skip, shuffle, karaoke, back pedal. How many of average people do anything besides just walk forward on a daily basis? They never walk backwards. They never walk sideways. You start introducing things like ladder and active warm-up to your clients, they feel silly, right? They're laughing, they feel uncoordinated. That's the good stuff. That's what we want. That's their nervous system refiguring out the things that they used to be able to do when they were younger, okay? And so Stu gets a lot of play in this presentation. Here's him and Nancy doing the ladder, right? And for them, like they actually, when they go to Italy, they have ladders they bring with them, and they send me videos of them doing the ladder in the yard. But for them, really important, right? Can you move sideways? Can you balance? Can you cross the midline, right? So our warm-up is a really good time for you to be creative as a coach and think, what can I challenge these people to do that they haven't done in a long time? To keep their brain firing, to keep the corpus callosum, that little thing that connects the right side and left side of the brain, firing signals back and forth. Something as simple as A-skips, high knee runs, butt kicks, shuffles. They don't have to look like Olympic athletes. I just want them moving. This is also power work, right? I just want them moving and trying new things, and then scale it down to the intensity they can do, right? When Stu and Nancy do a back pedal, this is their back pedal, right? This is their shuffle, right? I'm fine with that, okay? I always think every warm-up, I want them to move forwards, backwards, sideways, rotate. Whether that's a ladder drill, whether that's an active warm-up. I think if we're skipping the warm-up and just saying go ride the bike, we're missing a lot of the value, especially for our older population. Okay? By consistently challenging your brain with fresh mental activities, you continually force it to restructure, rewire, build new connections, and cope with the new demands placed upon it. So find safe little things you can start to add in over time. Like for them, I was even having them just like balance, pass something back and forth, throw a med ball on one leg, continue to find ways to challenge them. And then fact number 5. For every 1,000 additional steps per day, you decrease your all-cause mortality by about 15%. And that starts at about 3,200 steps from the research. Every 1,000 steps after that. And that probably goes up to about 10,000. There's various research. Some say 10,000, some say about 9,000. Safe to say somewhere around that. But it starts at about 3,000 steps per day. This is one of my clients, okay? So he's 60, divorced, lives by himself, is a little depressed. And so in 2020, when we really started tracking, because I was like, we got to get you moving, that was his average step count per day in 2020. Works from home. That's really low, right? 3,900 steps. I probably got 3,900 steps this morning before 8 o'clock, okay? And so I said, all right, well, we have to start there. If I told him, hey, you need 10,000 steps a day at that, he'd just never do it, right? So I said, all right, we're going to track. I want you to just start every day. His dog also just died at the same time, so he's had a bad run. So that was his main walking partner. So I'm like, hey, I want you to he has like a long driveway, so just walk down the driveway in between work calls. Okay, take a walk outside, come back. He's like, okay. So 2020, 2021, we're up 12.5%. Pretty significant. Still pretty low, but that's a year's worth of average where he was up 12.5% on average every day. Okay, so then what he started to do, he started to enjoy it. He's like, I started to feel a little more energy in between my work calls. I started to look forward to my walks. He's like, sometimes I'd add in some push-ups or some squats. I'm like, great. 2022, 6,200 steps. That's 33% increase. Okay, now we're getting there. You start to see the benefits where they say like the top end is probably around 8,000 or so. We're getting close. Now, 2023, this was sent to me in January. We're at 7,100. So it's a long-term approach. We're not going to get behavior change overnight. But you have to just start to say, how can I start to work a little bit of low-intensity activity, that's zone 2 work, into your day? And more now, people work from home. They're stuck on their computer all day. They have to add in these ideas of like exercise snacks, right? Where you can get a walk for 5 to 10 minutes, right? Steve and Carrie do their walk outside all the time, right? You have to work it in throughout the day so you get your ass up out of the chair, really, okay? And so I think long-term, when we're thinking about low-intensity activity, it's our job to help the client build a relationship with exercise long-term, right? We're helping them find the entry point to try to build a long-term relationship with exercise. So start to promote some regular physical activity away from the gym. Some of you probably have clients who are doing stuff all the time outside the gym, playing tennis, running, recreational sports. But we probably have a lot of people who the 2 hours they're with us a week is the only thing that they do. And the research goes to show we need to get them to do more than that. But those 2 hours with us is our window in to start to get that behavior change, right? And again, it's going to take years to happen. Start with easy targets like short walks. This was me at the Frankfurt airport a few weeks ago. Everybody was on the escalator. I just got off an 8-hour flight. I was like, I'm not taking the elevator, the escalator. I don't check a bag, so I had my bag. I was like, I'm just going to go up. There was like 3 sets of stairs like this I had to go up. I was pouring sweat. But I was the only one that took the stairs. But I was like, it got me moving, right? And there, you might think that doesn't do anything. Really interesting. The stair, did you see that study? It just came out? Yeah, really interesting. So they took a group and they did 3 by 30-second stair sprints for 6 weeks. 30 seconds as hard as they could. 126 total stairs. In 6 weeks, they improved their VO2 max by 7% just doing that. Just 30 seconds up the stairs 3 times. Not that hard to do. Right? And these people, when I say fast, they're not as fast as any of you. They were like sedentary individuals at baseline, right? And so just those little choices over time add up. Those exercise snacks make a really big difference if you're willing to make that choice regularly. Hey, I'm going to walk to go do that down the street. Or, I'm going to park a little further away at the grocery store rather than fighting someone and searching for that closer spot, right? All those little things add up. Yep. 3. Yeah. 3 times a week. Yeah. And just for 6 weeks, 126 stairs. Right? So not that much. Again, short interventions done at high intensity but done regularly can make a difference. And this is also the time to start being like, hey, maybe when you're not here, you can go for a brisk walk to start to do your zone 2 work. Or maybe you have a membership at Planet Fitness where it's $10 a month and you can go do the elliptical or the treadmill for 20 minutes. Right? And then maybe over time it becomes 30 minutes, and then it becomes 40 minutes, and they build a habit. Or, hey, come in here on your off day and ride the bike for 30 minutes at a low intensity and watch Netflix. I'm fine with that, right? But if we're trying to get them to do that in place of strength training, we're just not going to get anything else done. And so I think this is where you start to feed those things in, and then maybe they start to actually like it because they like exercise and they like their experience with you, okay? Because as it goes now, we're not even coming close to the minimum. Back to that same stat. It's 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate physical activity or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous physical activity or the equivalent of both. If you reach that at minimum, you reduce your mortality risk by about 21 to 33%. Okay? And again, we're not coming close statistically. This was a 2018 survey, so I'm sure it's not much different today. So should we be doing more? Yes. But we have to start at the 2 days a week that the average person comes. And if we do a great job building a relationship with exercise, we'll eventually get there. So this was interesting, and they saw over 25 years, people who are 4 to 7 day a week exercisers had significant changes in ventricular compliance, meaning how their ventricle stretches and pushes blood, a really good signifier of heart health and cardiovascular risk. When they saw people who were 2 to 3 day a week moderate exercisers, they had no difference in ventricle compliance from people who didn't exercise at all, right? And so again, we should be pushing people to do more, but we can't start with that. It's not sustainable for most people. It's about building a relationship over years where people are willing to do a little bit more exercise, okay? And because behavior change is hard. And we have to think of it, I like Mike's quote, training is like farming. You can't speed farm. You have to think of every relationship, whether it's a kid you're working with or an adult you're working with, that it's going to be a long-term relationship of behavior change. And that first session, that first 90 days is really, really crucial. I think someone asked me just the other day when I was here, like, what do you think about doing in that first session with them? I think it was one of the interns. I want it to feel easy. They come in for the first time into Mike Boyle Strength Conditioning. They see a bunch of people like you working out. They see the jerseys on the wall. They've sedentary, never exercised before. What do you think they're telling themselves the first time they come in? This place isn't for me. I don't belong here. They're scared, right? And so when they come in, I think sometimes our tendency as trainers is to be like, I'm going to crush them, I'm going to show how great I am. That's a great way to get them to never come back. What I want them to do is, partway through the workout, have that little dopamine that says like, oh, I can do this. Like, I'm motivated, right? The next day they wake up, they feel like they did something, but they're not so sore that they can't get up out of the chair. That's the right intervention the first time, because you lay a stone for them to continue a path to go forward, right? So look for layups, not three-pointers. Think about, hey, I'm going to show you you're going to be successful here, and then we build it from there. And then engage with something that they care about. Most our clients don't give a shit about deadlifts or bench press. They care about training because they want to be able to play with their kids, or they want to play tennis, or they want to run a 5K next year, right? They're not motivated necessarily by the things that we do in the gym. We like to lift weights. They don't really care. And so I think for them, we have to motivate them with meaning markers. Another good book, Sean Aker, Before Happiness, they looked at people in offices, and they did surveys, and they found those who had meaning behind their work. They said, hey, I'm passionate about training because I want to help people, not I train people because I want to make a living, right? They were 3 times more engaged and productive when they could tie their job to something that they cared about. Those who were not had higher levels of stress, anxiety, and were disengaged from their work. It's the same thing with exercise. And so if we're going to motivate people to do things more often and work a little bit harder, I think you have to continue to tie it into what they care about. Like, I have a guy that comes to see me, all he cares about is playing tennis 5 days a week. He's like, I want to play tennis 5 days a week, and he's 65. I said, okay, so everything we do is about his tennis. Stu and Nancy, it's about being able to travel the world and spend time with their grandkids and their family. Everything we do ties back to that. Then the how, if you can define the why for them, the how is very easy. They'll do anything you ask them to do. But they're not going to be motivated necessarily by lifting weights or just riding the bike. You have to say, hey, you got to ride this bike interval hard because I want you to be able to go to your granddaughter's wedding. Those are the interventions that make a big difference for them. And so being able to communicate that as a coach is really the key to that long-term behavior change, okay? So kind of in summary, what should our training look like? It's a recipe, not a menu. Again, all of those things that I just talked about, we have to be able to fit in to that 60-minute window. They have to get their mobility work. They have to do their power. They have to do their warm-up. They have to do their strength training. They have to do their conditioning. And so I think that our formula here that we do with our adult program works really, really well for that, okay? If you're going to follow it, if you're going to fit everything in. So mobility, we're typically going to get some hip, shoulder, ankle, cervical, whether it's foam rolling and active stretching every time they come in. We're going to get a multiplanar dynamic warm-up, whether it's ladder drills or skipping, shuffling, high knee runs. They're going to do a power circuit like I showed you previously. Skip, hop, jump, bound, and throw. Strength 2 to 3 days a week, that's full body. And then some sort of interval-based conditioning at the end. Primarily done on the bike. We'll also do some tempo running. We'll do some sled pushing to vary the mode a little bit, but generally we'll favor the bike for most people. And then progressively add lower intensity work into the lifestyle outside of the gym. I think if we take that approach, and it's going to look something like this, I'll send you guys the adult program as well in the slide content when you guys have access next week. That's generally what our recipe looks like, right? They'll come in, they'll get about 5 minutes of foam rolling, 5 minutes of mobility work, 4 minutes of like movement prep, 5 minutes of warm up, 5 minutes of ladder work. Then the rest of the time is going to be pairings and triceps done in the weight room. Again, push, pull, legs, core, different patterns and intensities and volumes. And then that last 8 to 15 minutes or so is going to be conditioning-based work. And that allows us to do this in a repeatable, commercial-based model that we can scale, that we can fit, 300-400 people through here in a day on a consistent basis. And for us, I think if we care about all those things, you have to be able to take an approach like that. Then eventually, if people start to exercise more, 5-6 days a week, we can start to maybe change the recipe a little bit, okay?